Okay, we're back to talk about leadership and systems leadership as a new kind of leadership. So we'll just start talking a bit about what exactly leadership is and kind of key characteristics of that. And in the context of systems change and the context of change, leadership, I would say, is a lot to do with people's response to change. And I think in the context of any situation where a group of people need to respond to an external change or a change of some kind, there will be a whole spectrum of responses to that. People who respond to that in different ways. And there will be those who resist that change, and quite often that'll be a majority of people. And there will, of course, then be a whole spectrum of people going to those who are unsure or responding in different ways, to people who actually embrace that change and essentially lead it. And we might say those are the leaders. Those are the people that see the needs for this change. And in the context of system change, these are people that see the need, actually, the system needs to change. Which can be quite rare. Normally, when there's a problem with systems, we try to, most of the time, we try to not actually look at the system itself. We try to trace those problems back to individual parts and fix those parts and so forth, and very much resist systems change because it's very challenging. So we're saying here, leadership in any context is about those people, or any change context, about those people who embrace the change. And in the context of system change, it's those people who embrace the need for systems change and then actually work to bring that into being. And those are the leaders, should we say, is what we're talking about here. But then to actually go and do that work, they need to, goes back to the idea of kind of building capacity and system for this change. Well, that starts with actually trying to shift the dynamic, the narrative and the response of the majority of people in that system from one of resistance and this change is a problem, and resisting the inevitable loss that's part of this change process, and being reactive to that, to one of building aspirations within the system, taking this challenge and not making it a problem, but turning it into an opportunity, a possibility. And of course, the leader itself, the person needs to, or the small group needs to first understand that themselves, see those possibilities and kind of embrace that themselves, and no longer just see this as a problem. And then articulate that, of course, so as to build that new narrative within the system, to actually take the paradigm and the dominant narrative within the system from one of this change is a problem, or diverting the problem, to individual parts, to actually starting to embrace it, saying, actually, we need systems change, and that's not just a problem. Yes, that will involve loss, but it also involves new opportunities, new possibilities, and a shared aspiration, ultimately, is what they're trying to build, what we need to build as systems leaders, to start to nurture and develop the capacity of this system for change. So the leaders are really the people who step across the line and embrace this when it may not be absolutely necessary that they do that, right? They see these changes coming, and they say, yes, I'm prepared to take this on, and create a new space. They're prepared to resist the forces that will never to be directed at them, right? So whenever there's a dominant narrative or regime, as soon as someone does something alternative to that, it will challenge that dominant paradigm. So it will threaten the existing system, and of course the people who step across the line and do something different, they will be presented with resistance and marginalization from the existing system. So that's an aspect of leadership and systems leadership. that you will essentially be going against the orthodoxy and taking that risk. So this is Benny Banerjee, who talks quite a bit about systems leadership. Quite a bit of the content in this tutorial is taken from him. When you're addressing really large-scale challenges and you really are motivated by big scale and you want to make a big difference, then what you need are methodologies that are significantly different from current ones, and even innovation methodologies that outperform the current innovation methodologies, but also different mindsets. You need different organizational behavior, and above all, you need a new kind of leadership. And that type of leadership we're calling systems leadership, and it's significantly different from business as usual. So I'd encourage you to take a look at some Benny Banerjee's videos. He talks a lot about this new kind of leadership that we'll jump into here, because we've all heard of leadership before, but we're talking about the systems leadership. So traditionally, he talks about leadership, or we think about leadership as these people they're in some existing structure, they're typically at the top of some hierarchy, they have certain authority, control, and so forth, and the capacity to make decisions that others will then execute on. And we call those people our leaders, or the leadership of an organization, or political system, and so forth. Here we're talking about quite a different one. We're talking about leading without authority, or leading across boundaries. We'll talk about this more in the future. And the context of systems change, that really takes place, within a particular organization. It's normally about, it's about growing a new network within a system, and that's new connections, new configurations, and so forth. You're making connections across borders, across boundaries, and putting together new networks that will ultimately become the new, grow a new system. So you're leading across borders and boundaries, across the domains within which people have authority and control and so forth. So it actually requires different kind of leadership, in the sense that it's a networked kind of leadership, and more about influence and attracting people and connecting them, leading them essentially through influence rather than through authority, and working through these connections and influences. And that's ultimately how change really happens, right? Change doesn't really happen, or happens a lot slower, through hierarchies. Hierarchies are designed for business as usual, for standard kind of procedural operating environments, whereas networks are actually a lot of how change happens through these more informal connections. And that's a lot of how you're going to be leading as a systems leader, as you reach out and connect across different parts of the system. So you're leading without authority, but more with influence, should we say. So this is Margaret Wheatley, who also talks a lot about leadership and systems leadership. Leadership is anyone who is willing to help. It is not a role, it's an action. When you see something that needs to be fixed, you step forwards, and in that moment, you become a leader. So that's an important part of it. It's not a role, it's actually an action. It's a thing you do. It's a thing you take on responsibility. We'll talk about that in a bit. And anyone who takes that on is essentially a leader, no matter where they reside in the system or which part of the organization. So often that comes from people who are outside positions of authority, these unusual suspects who you may not have thought who would be the actual people who would lead things or be prepared to take on this responsibility. So in general, leaders are people who see the whole, the changes taking place within the environment, and have a sense that they can shape their future and that others can also. And they work to enable groups of people to shape their future, creating the conditions, should we say. We'll talk more about that in the coming module, for a group of people to adapt and respond to the changes in the environment they're part of. So taking on responsibility when they don't necessarily need to is a key aspect of leadership. To be a systems changer, say a better system can be created, and you are going to take on some of the responsibility for realizing that. Instead of deferring that to others, you're taking it on yourself, and in so doing, that is an exercise of leadership. You're creating your leadership in that, taking on the responsibility instead of deferring it. It requires an appreciation for the multiple dimensions of the system, an appreciation for the complexity that is required to make the system operate on its different levels, so understanding the system you're part of and the changes that need to take place, and taking time to actually understand that broader context and the nature of the system you're part of and what's really needed to make these changes, and how you can actually serve and help and take on the responsibility of enabling that system, creating those conditions for it to self-actualize and respond to these changes. So we'll leave it there for now. I'll pick it up again in next module.